The sound of the violin echoed softly through the quiet streets, each note carrying a touch of sadness and beauty. It was a cold evening, and most people hurried along the sidewalk, their eyes fixed on the ground, eager to get home. Yet in the midst of this rush, there was one boy, no older than 15, sitting by the corner of a small park. His eyes were closed, his fingers moving gently over the strings, as if they held a secret only he could understand. The world around him seemed to disappear with every note, leaving only the music, like a dream woven from melody and memory. He had no audience, no applause, just the sound of his violin and the soft hum of the city behind him. Most passerby would barely glance his way, caught up in their own lives, their own problems. But this boy, with his worn-out clothes and untidy hair, didn't seem to mind. He played as though his life depended on it, pouring everything he had into each stroke of the bow. Maybe it was because music was his escape, his way of speaking the words his mouth could never say. Or maybe it was because, in the silence between each note, he found a kind of peace that the world could never offer. But then a passerby did stop. An older man, his coat heavy against the winter chill, slowed his steps when he heard the boy play. His face was unreadable at first, his gaze focused on the music, but there was something in the way his eyes narrowed, something almost familiar. The man leaned against a nearby lamppost, listening. The boy didn't notice him at first, lost in the flow of his music. But the man took a few more steps closer, his curiosity piqued. Something about the boy's playing felt different. There was a rawness in the sound, something unpolished but hauntingly real. Finally, as the last note of the violin hung in the air, the man spoke, his voice cutting through the silence. "You play well, but why here? Why this street with no one watching?" The boy's fingers faltered on the strings, his eyes snapping open. He stared at the man, surprised by this sudden interruption. There was something about his voice, something that felt both kind and probing, that caught him off guard. He had been used to being invisible. People usually walked past, too busy or too self-absorbed to notice him. But here was a man who not only noticed but had questions. The boy didn't answer right away. He looked down at his violin, the wood polish from years of use, his grip tightening on the neck. "I play because I have to," he said softly, almost as if to himself. "The music is all I have left." The man looked at him, his expression softening. There was a moment of quiet between them, the kind of quiet that fills the air when you know something significant is about to be said. The boy waited, unsure of what the man would say next. The passerby, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and curiosity, stepped a little closer. But why this corner? Why not somewhere else? The boy shifted uncomfortably. He didn't like explaining himself, especially not to strangers. Music was the only way he knew how to communicate, and even then, it felt like a part of him was missing, like the music was just a shadow of what he really wanted to say. But this man seemed different from everyone else he had met. He didn't look at him with pity, nor did he hurry past like the others. There was something familiar in his eyes, like he understood. "I don't have anywhere else to go," the boy finally admitted, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't have a place where people want to listen. This street, it's all I have." The older man nodded, a flicker of something in his gaze. For a brief moment, the boy thought the man would walk away. But instead, the man took a step closer, his voice lowering as if sharing a secret. "You know, music has a way of finding people. It speaks louder than words ever could. But it also finds the broken, the lost." The boy's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air, their weight sinking into him. He didn't understand why the man had said that, but it felt too close to something he had never dared to admit. His grip on the violin tightened once more, as though holding it could keep whatever the man was implying at bay. "Who are you?" The boy blurted out before he could stop himself, the question slipping from his lips like a reflex. The man had spoken with such certainty, such understanding. It was almost as if he knew more than he should. The older man looked at him, his eyes momentarily distant, as if he were weighing the boy's question carefully. There was a flicker of something hidden beneath his calm demeanor, something the boy couldn't quite place. "I'm someone who's been lost before," the man said slowly, his voice quiet but firm. "Someone who's also searched for a way out, but didn't know where to find it. You're not alone in that. But the question is, what will you do with what you found?" The boy felt a chill run down his spine. The words didn't make sense, but they hit him harder than anything he had ever heard. It was as though the man knew something about him, something deep inside that he hadn't even fully understood himself. The air around them seemed to shift, the streetlights casting long shadows on the ground, as if the world itself was waiting for the boy to answer. He stood up, the violin still cradled in his arms, unsure of what to say. His heart was racing, and his mind was spinning. What did the man mean? Was this just a conversation between two strangers, or was there something more? The tension hung thick in the air, a moment frozen in time, neither moving forward nor backward. And then, before the boy could respond, the man turned and began to walk away, his footsteps slowly fading into the distance. The boy stood there, his fingers still gripping the violin, his mind reeling with questions he didn't have answers to. What was it that the man had known? What was it that he needed to do? The music, which had once felt like his only way of speaking, now seemed to hold a new weight. Something was about to change, but what? He glanced at the same street that had always felt like his world. But tonight, it felt different, like the silence was telling him something he couldn't yet understand. The boy was left standing in the cold, the unanswered question hanging in the air. The boy stood in the same spot, his violin still pressed against his chest, but his thoughts had already begun to drift far away from the cold street. He could hear the distant hum of the city, the sounds of everyday life continuing on, indifferent to his quiet moment of confusion. The passerby had vanished into the crowd, and now only the lingering echo of the man's words remained. What did he mean? What was the boy supposed to do now? He had lived a life of solitude, moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to be noticed. Music had always been his constant companion, his only form of expression. The violin had been his voice when he had none, the only way to let the world know he was there. But the older man's words had cracked something open inside him, something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The boy had always thought that the music was enough to keep him going, that the next note would somehow fill the emptiness inside. But now he wasn't so sure. His mind raced, replaying the man's cryptic statement. Music finds the broken. Was he broken? He had never thought of himself that way. He had always seen himself as just a boy with a violin, a boy who played because there was nothing else. But what if the man was right? What if the music was a reflection of something deeper, something dark and unresolved? His hands trembled as he thought about it. The boy's life hadn't always been like this. There had been a time when his world was full of warmth and light. He had a family, a mother and father who supported his dreams, who bought him the violin when he was just 5 years old. It had been a gift, a symbol of their belief in his talent. He remembered those days clearly, his mother's soft smile as she listened to him play, his father's encouragement, always telling him that one day he would be famous. But that was before everything fell apart. It had started slowly, little cracks in the foundation of his world. His father's health began to decline, the once strong man becoming weaker and weaker with each passing month. The medical bills piled up, and the arguments between his parents became more frequent, louder. Then, one day, his father was gone. A heart attack, sudden and unexpected. The boy's world shattered. He didn't know how to deal with it. Music had been his escape, his way of coping, but it wasn't enough. It never would be. His mother, unable to handle the weight of her grief, became distant. She stopped encouraging him, stopped listening to his playing. The boy tried to hold on to his music, but the silence between them grew too loud, too heavy. Eventually, they both drifted apart, and he found himself on his own, wandering the streets with only his violin as company. No one seemed to care, no one asked where he had come from or where he was going. The world was full of people, but he felt invisible, lost in the noise of life. That was how it had always been, until today. Until the man had stopped and asked him those questions. The boy had been so used to playing for no one that the idea of someone truly seeing him, truly understanding him, was almost too much to bear. But there was something else, something the boy hadn't shared, something even darker than his past. In his quiet moments, when the world around him was silent, he could feel it, a hunger, a craving for something more than just music. A longing that gnawed at him, that told him there was something he was meant to find, something that would fill the emptiness. He had tried to ignore it, to bury it beneath the strings of his violin, but it was always there, lurking in the shadows of his mind. And now the man's words had awakened it. He had to find out what it meant. He couldn't go on like this, playing for no one, living in the silence. But where could he start? How could he break free from the cycle of loneliness and grief that had defined his life? The boy packed up his violin and walked slowly down the street, his thoughts swirling. The city around him felt different now, as though everything had changed in that brief moment of interaction. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he couldn't go back to the way things were. Not anymore. As he walked, his mind kept returning to the older man's face, the way his eyes had held something the boy couldn't quite understand. The man hadn't just seen him, he had seen through him. And in that moment, the boy realized something. The man wasn't just a stranger. He knew more about him than he was letting on. There was a connection, something deeper than chance. The boy turned down a narrow alley, his steps quickening as a new thought struck him. Maybe the man wasn't gone after all. Maybe he was still out there, still waiting for him to make a choice, to follow him into whatever mystery he was hinting at. He didn't know where he was going, but something told him that the answer wasn't on the busy streets of the city. The answer was somewhere hidden, somewhere quiet. And for the first time in a long time, the boy felt a flicker of hope. He had never been the kind to trust others, never been the kind to open up. But something about the man's words, about the way he had asked the boy why he was playing, made him believe that maybe this stranger could help him find the answers he had been searching for all these years. The boy's heart raced with anticipation. What would he find if he followed the man? Would the music finally lead him somewhere, somewhere that could heal the wounds he had carried for so long? As he turned the corner, he saw a figure in the distance, standing just outside a small, dimly lit cafe. The man. The boy's steps faltered, and he hesitated for a moment, his breath catching in his chest. This was it, the moment where everything would change. He took a deep breath and walked toward the man, his violin hanging loosely by his side. The man didn't turn around at first, but when he did, his expression was unreadable. He looked at the boy as if he had been expecting him. And then, without a word, he motioned for the boy to follow him inside. "You're wondering why I brought you here," the man said, his voice low but steady. "You're wondering why you felt like you had to follow me. But there's a reason for that, a reason you don't yet understand." The boy finally looked up, meeting the man's eyes. "What do you mean? What's going on here? Who are you really?" The man smiled slightly, almost as if he had been expecting this. My name isn't important. What's important is that you've been playing your violin for so long, searching for something you couldn't find. But I think you've already found it, without realizing it. The boy frowned, confusion taking over. What are you talking about? I've been playing, yes. But it's just music. There's nothing more to it. The boy didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, the door closing behind him with a soft click. And as he crossed the threshold, the feeling of uncertainty and fear surged through him. But so did something else, something that felt like the beginning of a new chapter. The door closed softly behind the boy, and for a moment, everything felt unreal. He stood in the dimly lit cafe, the air thick with the scent of old wood and freshly brewed coffee. The sound of the city outside seemed to fade away completely, leaving him with only the strange man and the lingering tension in the room. The man motioned for the boy to sit at a small table in the corner, and he obeyed without question, his curiosity far stronger than his hesitation. The cafe was almost empty, save for a couple sitting quietly in the far corner. The man sat across from him, folding his hands calmly on the table. There was a strange stillness to the air, as if time itself had slowed down. The boy could feel the weight of the man's gaze, but he couldn't bring himself to look up just yet. The questions swirling in his mind were too overwhelming. The man shook his head slowly. No, you've been searching for healing, for a way to fill the empty space inside you. Music was never just music for you. It was your way of coping, your way of hiding from the pain. But you can't hide forever. It's time to face it. A chill ran through the boy's spine. He wanted to argue, wanted to deny it, but the man's words hit too close to home. Everything the man said felt right, felt like something he had been too afraid to admit to himself. You've been carrying around your father's death, your mother's silence, your own loneliness. You've been letting it shape you, control you. But you don't have to anymore, the man continued, his voice softening. Music can heal, but it can't do it alone. You have to allow yourself to heal too. You have to let go of the past and find a new path. The boy's heart pounded in his chest. He had never spoken about his father, never allowed himself to truly grieve. The man had struck a nerve, a part of him that he had buried so deep, he didn't even realize it was there anymore. The grief, the anger, the fear, it all came rushing back in a wave he wasn't prepared for. The room felt smaller now, the weight of his emotions pressing down on him. He looked down at his violin, his fingers resting on the worn strings. How had it come to this? Music had always been his safe place, the one thing that never let him down. But the idea that it couldn't fix everything, that it couldn't make him whole again, felt like a betrayal. How do I let go? The boy whispered, his voice barely audible. How do I stop carrying all this? The man leaned forward slightly, his eyes kind but firm. You start by accepting that you can't do it alone anymore. You've been playing for an audience of one, yourself. But you can't heal in isolation. You need others. You need to find a way to share your pain, to let it out in a way that frees you. The boy's eyes widened. Share my pain. But who would listen? Who would care? The man's smile was gentle but knowing. There are people who will listen. There are people who will care. But you first need to believe that you're worthy of that care. The boy felt something shift inside him. A quiet realization that he had been holding on to his pain like it was all he had left. He had hidden behind his violin, behind the notes, behind the music as a shield. But the truth was, he was tired of hiding. What do I do now? He asked, his voice stronger now, more determined. The man's eyes softened, as if he had been waiting for the boy to ask that question all along. Now you start living differently. You take your music and you share it, not because you need to escape, but because it's part of who you are. You let people see you, the real you, and you let them help you heal. The boy took a deep breath, his grip on his violin loosening slightly. For the first time in years, he felt like there was a way out of the darkness. He wasn't alone. He didn't have to face this by himself. As the man stood up and moved toward the door, he paused and turned back to the boy. "One more thing," he said softly. "The hardest part is going to be the first step. But once you take it, you'll never have to walk alone again." The boy nodded, his heart heavy but hopeful. He didn't have all the answers, but he was ready to try. Ready to face the pain. Ready to share his music and his story with the world. The man smiled one last time before leaving, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The boy sat alone at the table for a moment, the weight of the moment sinking in. He had a long journey ahead of him, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. He stood up slowly, violin in hand, and walked toward the door. As he stepped back out into the cold, the street no longer felt like an empty, indifferent place. It felt full of possibility. And for the first time, he understood what the man had meant. Music had found him, but it was time for him to find himself too. To share his story. To heal. As the boy walked down the street, the first notes of a new song echoed softly from his violin, a song of hope, of healing, and of finding the courage to move forward. The city, once so vast and lonely, now felt a little smaller, a little more welcoming. And for the first time in a long time, the boy didn't feel so invisible.